Welcome again to one more episode where you learn how to say no to any medical sentence. Today, my guest is Dr. Benjamin Bikman. He's an author and he's an absolute scientist in the sense that he's not a clinician. He spends his day researching and telling us what he finds out and how we can apply it in a clinical standpoint or for our own lives. Dr. Bikman, Ben, welcome. How are you?
Oh, my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Coco. I'm doing very well. I'm happy to speak about all things related to human metabolism.
All right, so let's go on it. You're the author of the book Why We Get Sick, and I was fascinated the first time I read it because for the first time, actually, I saw a link by a researcher that put the pieces together between diseases that we are living today that we think that have absolutely nothing to do with sugar and the impact of insulin, which is triggered by sugar. Talk to me a little bit about insulin resistance. What is that? Everybody talks about it, but what is it in layman terms?
Yeah, so you pitched this or framed this very, very well. I sometimes refer to insulin as the great mediator, and where we are pointing a finger at refined starches and sugars, at these bad carbohydrates. I would say that very much of what makes that bad, what connects these carbohydrates to the unhealthy cell, is what it's doing to insulin. And that, of course, is relevant with insulin resistance. So insulin resistance is a disease that it's the most common disorder in the world, and yet it's a disease that most people have never heard of. And that's why I didn't call my book Insulin Resistance, Why You Should Care, because no one would care. They would see the word insulin and think it was just relevant to someone with diabetes. So Why We Get Sick was a better title because it really touches on the underlying explanation. So insulin resistance is best described as a coin. And so if I'm holding a coin in my hand, the coin has two sides. And on one side of this coin that I'm calling insulin resistance is the fact that some of the cells of the body aren't responding to insulin as well as they used to. Now, the body has hundreds of different types of cells in the trillions. And each of these cells, literally every single cell of the body, will respond to insulin in some way. So insulin can tell every cell in the body to do something. Now, there's a lot of different somethings because there's so many different types of cells. But some of these cells stop responding to insulin as well as they did before. So insulin comes and knocks on the door of the cell. Some of the cells, like muscle cells, for example, they don't answer the door anymore. But other cells will answer the door perfectly well. And so some of the cells of the body are still responding to insulin. And that matters when we flip the coin over and the other side of the coin, which is that blood insulin levels are chronically high. So these two things come together, or they're the two sides of the coin of insulin resistance. One side is that insulin isn't working as well as it used to throughout the body. And then the other side is that blood insulin levels are chronically higher than they used to be.
So, looking at that scenario of these resistance, these cells that are saying, you know what, I use the example of you have this very annoying friend that keeps on calling you, and you just either block the person or you just click denial. And that's what the cells are doing. It's like, I don't need it, just don't bring it anymore. What diseases have you seen that are really epidemics around the world that are linked to the resistance of insulin?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, it is almost from top to bottom. We are learning more and more all the time about how Alzheimer's disease is a disease of insulin resistance of the brain, one particular little part of the brain called the hippocampus, which is where we make our memories and where we learn. That becomes insulin resistant, and that's very likely at the heart of Alzheimer's disease. Something as common as hypertension or elevated blood, which is a plague. Almost every adult suffers from some form of high blood pressure. Not all, but most do. And hypertension is almost always a result of insulin resistance. And to say that another way, it's incredibly rare for someone to have high blood pressure and it not be caused by insulin resistance. So that plays into heart disease as well. Heart disease is the number one killer, and it's no coincidence that insulin resistance just happens to be the leading driver of heart disease. And then even some things that you wouldn't expect, like infertility, where a woman who has polycystic ovary syndrome or PCOS, that is almost always a result of insulin resistance. And that's the most common form of infertility in women. And in men, a completely different problem, of course, erectile dysfunction. That's the most common form of infertility in men. And once again, insulin resistance is considered the earliest clinical cause of erectile dysfunction. And erectile dysfunction is viewed as a sign that there's something wrong metabolically. And then Coco, I could go on about the fatty liver disease, osteoporosis, muscle wasting, sarcopenia, and numerous other diseases. In short, or in summary, almost every chronic disease that does not come from an infection, so every non-infectious chronic disease in some way is impacted by insulin resistance. The insulin resistance is either causing the problem or it's making the problem worse.
I want to go back with the disease or the condition of high blood pressure, which, as you said, is very common. Explain to us in layman terms what happens. There is a concept that salt. You're putting too much salt in your food. I've never controlled my salt intake. I have actually very low blood pressure by nature, but it never makes sense to me, the salt theory, until I read in your book that there is a link between something that occurs in the kidney. Can you explain that? What is turned off and how that increases the blood pressure, and it has nothing to do with your salt intake? The salt may play a role afterwards, but it's not the cause.
Oh, that's absolutely right. Yeah, so there have been ample human studies that have put people into different groups of all kinds of salt levels. They're eating lots of salt and they're eating essentially no salt. And the actual changes in blood pressure are like 1 or 2 points. It just does not move the needle when you really just try to cut your salt, because it's really more of what the body is trying to do with that salt. We need salt. We have to eat it. So it would be incompatible with life to cut it out entirely. It's really a matter of what's the body doing with the salt. So pulls water with it. Wherever there's salt, the body and cells of the body and the different compartments of the body, like in the blood vessels or out of the blood vessels, in the lymph vessels or out, wherever there's salt, it will want to pull water into that area. And we have a way of regulating salt to make sure that we aren't keeping too much, and that's through the actions of a hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone is part of this hormone signal that's constantly sampling the blood. And if the blood has too much salt, aldosterone will tell the kidneys to get rid of that salt because there's an excess. And if the body has too little salt, aldosterone will be part of this signal to tell the kidneys to keep the salt. And of course, wherever the salt goes, the water will go with it. Now, aldosterone, which we typically look at as the kind of king controller of what the kidneys do with salt and with water, it is actually answerable, or it's sort of the prince to the actual king here, or queen, which is insulin. Insulin dictates what aldosterone is going to do, even independent of salt. So if salt were high, aldosterone would want to turn off to let the salt go. But if insulin is high, insulin doesn't give aldosterone the choice. Insulin goes up, it pulls aldosterone, this hormone, up with it. And by pulling aldosterone up, now the kidneys have no choice. They also have to keep that salt and keep all the water. And if we're keeping more water means more pressure, and so blood pressure will go high. And that is why one of the very first changes someone will see in their body when they start adopting dietary changes to lower their insulin, they lower their insulin, the aldosterone comes down, and now the kidneys just dump all of that extra salt in the water that they've been forced to hold on to because insulin wasn't giving it a choice.
Fatty liver disease. There are so many people that don't know that they have fatty liver disease. I think that the studies are saying that over 25% of adults have fatty liver disease, and many of them don't know it. What causes fatty liver disease?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know you've interviewed Robert Lustig before, so I just have to share. I have to pay respect to him and how he has so well highlighted the dangers of fructose. So I would say there's two mechanisms whereby our diet is going to promote the liver to store too much fat and get too fat, which in and of itself isn't going to harm you necessarily, but it's what it leads to. Fatty liver disease is a gateway problem for actual catastrophic liver problems. And the liver is so essential that if it starts to suffer, the body is going to suffer heavily. So the one route I mentioned with Dr. Lustig pointing this out and highlighting it is that we eat too much of molecules that just turn into fat. So fructose is uniquely fattening in the liver because it doesn't need insulin to tell it what to do. If the liver is seeing a lot of fructose because someone's drinking lots of juice or soda, or they're eating lots of junk food with sugar and high fructose corn syrup, the liver just sees that fructose, and there's so much of it that it just starts turning it into fat, just like it does with alcohol. Alcohol can be drank in excess, and it won't change your insulin at all, but it will still promote the storage of fat in the liver. It's because while the liver has to metabolize most of the fructose, the liver also has to metabolize most of the alcohol. And when we load it with this nutrient, fructose or alcohol, the liver just gets it starts to take that energy from the fructose or the alcohol and turn it into fat, because fat is a more efficient way to store the energy. Now, independent of that, if someone is spiking their insulin very often, then the liver is simply told to make more fat. One of the things insulin does at the liver is tell the liver to make fat. And so the liver starts to make more fat, and we have more fat circulating and more fat storing because the insulin is dictating it.
When we think of fructose and glucose, fructose is what makes the fruit sweet. And usually the idea is, well, it's fructose, it's from fruit, it's good, it's healthy. But speaking at a molecular level, and you touched on that, talking about fatty liver, what can fructose be used in the body for other than converting it into fat? Does it have any physiological, biological function in the body?
The short answer is there's nothing essential, so no. But another short answer would be that fructose can be used as energy. It gets converted. Basically, it comes into this glucose pathway, the biochemical pathway. And so the body, some cells, not every cell, most cells of the body can't even pull fructose in. And so the fructose just it flows right by on the blood. Unlike glucose, which can go into literally every single cell and be used for energy, fructose cannot. There are only very few cells that can use fructose. And in no way is it ever a benefit. I mean, not that there isn't something to be said for a cell having energy, but in the liver, every time the liver starts pushing the fructose to be burned for energy, you end up creating a uric acid molecule. And that is why this is a bit off topic, but people who have gout, they will be told, oh, you need to avoid your meat. That's silly. We don't eat any more meat now than we did almost 100 years ago. But you look at fructose consumption, which has skyrocketed. Every time you burn a fructose molecule, you start creating more uric acid, which is the cause of gout, too much uric acid. So that's, of course, not a metabolic phenomenon. But the short answer is in fact, let me even mention the fat cell. When a fat cell takes in fructose to metabolize it, it actually enhances the fat cell's response to cortisol. And cortisol makes fat cells big in an unhealthy way. And, there's two different ways for fat tissue to growth, and I won't get into that now. But cortisol, or as the fructose comes into the fat cell, it basically commits the fat cell to the unhealthy way of getting fat. So there's almost no good that comes from fructose. Not that you can't use it for energy, you can, but even then, every time you are using fructose for energy, you're getting more uric acid, which could be playing into someone's gout.
Something that you touch in your book very graciously is aging, anti-aging, and insulin resistance, and overall the impact of high levels of insulin in your diet. As a woman, I'm 47, we're always interested on looking young and feeling healthy. Would you say that beauty and anti-aging from the outside, not at a cellular level, has a correlation, not just with being overweight, but with the metabolical issues that we're discussing here in the consumption of sugars?
Yeah, I think so. So first of all, there are some very obvious skin disorders that come in, which, if we're going to kind of use the skin as a kind of a marker of aging, which is defended, that's a good view. There are very real skin disorders that come from insulin resistance, independent of aging. So it's not like it's even making your cells older. That's a terrible, unscientific thing to say. But independent of the aging of a cell, if someone has insulin resistance, they are much more likely to have skin disorders like psoriasis or acanthosis nigricans, which is basically, big dark sections of skin. Or another one is skin tags, these bumps of skin that people will have around their neck or around their armpits. These, and I don't mean like a mole, but like a kind of like a little pillar of
And
skin.
and and
So
let
they're,
me let me stop you there about the skin tags, because that question comes up a lot in the channel. Why do people with high levels of insulin get the skin tags? What happens at a cellular level?
yeah, yeah. So it's actually a result of the elevated insulin. Remember, insulin resistance is two things. Insulin isn't working well, and it's chronically high insulin. Insulin likes to stimulate cells to grow. That is kind of the common theme of insulin across all of the trillions of cells in the body. Insulin wants the cells to grow. Well, that's of course not a bad thing. We need cells to grow, but we need them to grow when they're supposed to grow. We need them to shrink and, in some instances, die when they're supposed to. And so with skin, the hyperinsulinemia, the high insulin level itself, is thought to just basically overstimulate the skin cells to grow in this kind of spontaneous method. And these areas around the neck and armpits are, and it's other areas as well, essentially wherever skin is rubbing together. Now, you and I are lean enough that we don't really have any rubbing of the skin around our neck. But as someone gets a little heavier, that is something where they'll typically get a skin fold. There'll be some little fold of fat around their neck, and then certainly the armpits or around the groin or the knees, where there is rubbing of skin. There's naturally a higher turnover of that skin. That we're losing skin cells, we're making more skin cells, and so that area in the midst of high insulin is just stimulating the growth of skin too much. And that kind of gets to the aging idea then, to answer that question, more directly. The key to aging is to allow cells to undergo, or aging well, rather, is to allow cells to undergo a process called autophagy. And autophagy, I'm sure your audience already knows this, but autophagy is a process whereby a cell starts to take the old parts of itself and it breaks the old parts down to rebuild the new parts. So that's not to say that the cell is breaking down or dying and becoming, and a new cell takes its place. That's not what I'm saying. That is a process called apoptosis, and that's not inherently bad either. Cells are supposed to die when they're supposed to die. Autophagy is where a cell analyzes all of its components, the mitochondria, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum, all these different things within a cell that make the cell work. And it says, the mitochondria are getting old. I'm going to break down the old ones and make new mitochondria. That is a process that insulin abhors. Insulin does not want autophagy to happen because it takes energy. A cell has to work. It can't be busy growing if it's cleaning house, if it's breaking itself down to rebuild parts of itself. So insulin inhibits autophagy. And that is a problem when it comes to aging well, because if insulin's chronically elevated, then you have cells that can't clean themselves. They can't renew themselves. They're stuck with all of their old parts.
You dedicated a whole chapter to gastrointestinal health, which is a topic that I'm so interested on, because people live chronically bloated, chronically with acid reflux. What have you seen as the root cause of all the many gastrointestinal imbalances that a lot of patients and viewers are experiencing? Let's start with acid reflux.
Yeah, yeah. So in fact, I think that there are two different ways to break down GI problems. One is a problem of irritation, and then one is a problem of growth. The latter one is where insulin resistance really rears its head, and that is very consequential because colon or gut cancers are so common. And that's because this gastrointestinal tract is used to, once again, like skin, having a very high turnover. These are cells that can grow very, very rapidly. And just like with the skin tags, if insulin is high, it's telling these gastrointestinal cells to grow too much. And too much growth is essentially cancer. And so we have on one hand the consequences of the growth of the foods that we're eating because it's spiking insulin and that's promoting growth of gut cells. Then on the other hand, there's an insulin independent aspect, which is the irritation. And I'm convinced, and there's certainly data to support this view, that much of gastric reflux and irritable bowel problems, and even more consequential ones like ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease, they can be very well controlled by a person paying attention to what they're putting in their mouths in the first place. So there are foods, again, independent of what insulin's doing, that are simply irritating different people's intestines and their gastrointestinal tract in general. So but what's interesting is that it is almost always going to be a plant-based food, always a carbohydrate. Now, I'm not declaring war on all carbohydrates, but those are almost always the biggest offenders that someone is having a sensitivity to. And this is why I think you have people with what they would consider to be disastrous or catastrophic GI problems like ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease. And when they go on a diet that is very restrictive with carbohydrates, including in some instances dropping carbohydrates completely, they have a total reversal of whatever the gastrointestinal problem is. Their reflux disease goes away, or their ulcerative colitis resolves, or their Crohn's disease. The number of people I've seen, and it's in the dozens now, who report an almost total reversal, if not total reversal, of these diseases that they've been trying for years to correct with medications. It really is mind blowing. And so that's the irritation side, where these same foods that tend to be the most irritable to the intestines, like plant foods, like wheat, for example, that's just an obvious one, also tend to be the biggest offenders when it comes to what insulin levels are going to do.
Looking at microbiome, and I don't know how much you've researched into the microbiota and the microbiome and talking on the impact of plants. Have you done any research on SIBO, the small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, and the impact of insulin? How these, first of all, if you know what is SIBO, tell me what that is. And also, how does this migration of bacteria that is supposed to be in the large intestine opportunistically appears in the small intestine, and what's the relationship with insulin?
Yeah. What a great question, Coco. And so I'm not a gut microbiome expert. So I'll share my limited insight in that regard. On one hand, I acknowledge that the microbiome is absolutely essential to good human health. When people have been on high doses of antibiotics to treat an infection that might not be related to the gut at all, the gut naturally sees that antibiotic, and you decimate your gut bacteria. And those are people that are significantly more likely to gain more weight. Even eating all things considered equal, all things equal, the more a person is taking an antibiotic and the longer, the more likely they are to gain weight and become insulin resistant. So there's no question in my mind that the bacteria in our intestines are relevant. Now, having said that, I don't know. I think sometimes people are too quick to say we need to eat this way to change these bacteria, or this way to eat these to change those bacteria. I don't know. I'm a little more agnostic or unsure of that, because I think anything we do will change our gut bacteria. You fast, you eat this, you eat that, you do one thing different, you exercise, you don't. Everything will change our gut microbiome in some way. I just don't know whether all those changes are essential to the health of whatever that habit may be. Fasting is good for you. Is it because of what it does to your bacteria in your intestines? I don't know that. Now with SIBO, I think I once again, I'm not an expert in this regard, but I can't help but wonder where you noted very accurately that it's this migration of the bacteria in the large intestine, which is where we ferment fibers and starches. They basically start to move upwards into the intestine where they have no business being. I can't help but wonder, is that a result of us feeding bacteria too much? Maybe we're eating too much fiber or too much starch or sugar, because that is the only thing bacteria can eat. Bacteria do not eat fat. Bacteria do not eat ketones. They do not eat lactate, these other nutrients that have an energy to most of our body cells. They can only eat glucose and fiber. Even a nutrient that we can't get caloric value from, like a dietary fiber, like especially a soluble fiber, which I'm an advocate of in general. But maybe these are instances where we're feeding them too much, and then we're allowing them to grow a little too rampantly.
I'm an advocate of higher fat diets. Are you familiar with with high fat? Obviously, it's going to release high levels of bile, but that will have an impact on the hydrogen sulfide producing bugs. Have you seen people with sebum, with GI problems, having issues when they eat too much fat, or those are very isolated clinicians types of cases that have been reported?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I've not seen that before, but it is sure compelling. It's something I clearly need to learn more about because it's pretty interesting.
So I interviewed somebody that said that if you have not, and not for everybody, and that's the beauty of the human body, that we're so unique, that some people, when they eat high amounts of fat, at the time of releasing more bile will create or will impact the hydrogen sulfide producing bacteria, and they become worse. So they have a flare up of symptoms from fat because of that cascade. So I just was wondering if you've ever heard
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, I've not heard that. In fact, there's a little cynical part of me kind of whispering in my ear that just wonders one thing, that it might be something else. I can't help but wonder whether it is related to the gallbladder, and not so much a matter of the bile is making this worse, but it's rather that a person has gallstones, and that as the person's eating fat and the gallbladder is trying to eject all of the bile that it has stored from the liver, it hurts when that happens. And I know that happens where a person eats fat and they feel discomfort. Ironically, well, discomfort because the gallbladder has stones in it. Ironically, those stones likely formed because the person wasn't eating enough fat originally. One of the key causes of gallstones is a lack of fat in the diet, where all of that bile that was sent into the gallbladder from the liver, it's waiting for fat to come down the intestines so it can release all the bile. But when there's not enough fat, all that bile acid stays in the gallbladder, and it starts to kind of coalesce and crystallize, and you end up getting gallstones. And now, when the person eats fat, all those stones are kind of disrupting the gallbladder from working, and it hurts quite a bit.
Keeping on the role of the metabolical function, and in your book, one of the chapters says why we get fat, and I think that that's a worldwide question that specifically men and women, why do I gain weight so easily? And in your book, you talk about several different metabolical and hormonal factors. Can you help me a little bit? Leptin resistance, how does the body work? Why is that some people may not actually be responding to leptin, and that affects their weight?
Yeah, yeah. In fact, what a great question. So obesity is an enormous topic, and it's very polarizing. People feel very strongly. My view on it is a little more, I think, nuanced based on data. So, but I'll start with leptin and then get on to insulin versus energy when it comes to obesity. But I'll be brief. So with leptin, it's interesting to note that in people with leptin does matter, no question. You have humans that have actual mutations in leptin production where they aren't making it in their brain, or they have a mutation in the ability of the cells of the body to sense the leptin, so a leptin receptor mutation, and they will become fantastically overweight very, very early in life. And they have an insatiable appetite where in the rodents, when we use lab mice that have leptin mutations, they are so hungry that they will eat their own waste. They just have an insatiable appetite. They never are able to stop eating. Now, what is so interesting though, in those same animals that become really fat, adorably fat, really, really fat mouse is a kind of a cute little mouse. But if you block insulin in those mice, they stay lean. Even though they want to keep eating, if you block the insulin level, they stay lean. And that is so important and so often overlooked because leptin is actually an inhibitor of insulin. And so when leptin is working well, then it's trying to tell the insulin to stay down. And so that's the key. That's the missing link. Where even when we talk about leptin in its role with obesity, and we talk about it, well, it's a satiety hormone and it tells you when to stop eating. Well, that doesn't necessarily connect it to the obesity part. because in these lab animals, if you inhibit the insulin, they don't get fat. So it's clearly not just a function of the leptin. It's because of what leptin does to insulin. And if a person has become leptin resistant, which happens in humans, then they become resistant to what leptin's trying to do to the insulin. Leptin is really high. It would normally push the insulin down. It doesn't work because the body's become leptin resistant. Now the insulin is high. And that sort of segues me into this other idea of obesity, which is it really being a matter of insulin and energy. And both of these are essential to a fat cell or someone's fat tissue getting bigger. You cannot have a fat cell grow unless insulin is elevated. It is absolutely impossible. Insulin controls the growth and shrinking of a fat cell. If insulin is high, fat cells have no choice. They're going to grow. If insulin is low, they have no choice. The fat cells will shrink. But at the same time, we can't pull that away from actually having enough energy, because if insulin is high, then what it does is it tells the body where to store the energy that is in the blood. It essentially tells the fat cells, take all of that energy, that is all the glucose and all the fat that is flowing in the blood right now, and store it. But if there's no energy to store, then there's nothing to store. And that actually can't happen. A person would die. If insulin was really high and there wasn't enough energy in the blood, then the energy would go too low and the person would die because the brain wouldn't have enough glucose or ketones. So you can't pull these two apart. But to look at what happens at the level of the fat cell, it's a matter of high insulin telling the body what to do with the high energy. And that is why calorie number does matter. The amount of energy we're putting in does matter. Now, I do not support counting calories, because I think that it's fruitless to try to know every calorie you're putting in and just what your body's going to do with those calories and how you are expending calories. No one can ever know that really well. So I don't mean to say calories don't have a relevance in human obesity. They absolutely do. I just don't think we should base our obesity paradigm on calories in, calories out, because then a person will be eating low-fat foods of everything, and these low-fat foods are going to be high carbohydrate and high sugar, and now they're spiking their insulin. And when insulin goes up, the actual amount of energy in the blood goes down. And so when that goes down, that might be why when someone eats an insulin-spiking meal, they're much hungrier, much sooner than someone who eats the exact same number of calories but doesn't spike their insulin. So if they eat a high carbohydrate breakfast, they will be hungrier sooner than someone who eats the exact same number of calories but with a low carbohydrate breakfast. And now that person will have much more satiety. They will not be hungry as early. And it could be because when insulin goes up, the energy in the blood goes down. It's pushing it into fat cells, for example. And then the brain is thinking, wait, where did all the energy go? We're getting low on glucose and low on ketones and low on fats, and I need energy, so I need you to eat more, because the brain can't store energy like the fat cells and the muscle cells can. They need it constantly. The brain needs it constantly to be coming from the blood.
Going back to the subject of fructose and fatty liver and alcohol, alcoholic fatty liver, and alcohol itself, why would somebody, let me give you this scenario. A person does intermittent fasting and has for dinner 2 days, different days, same dinner, but one of the days that dinner is preceded by alcohol. The day that the dinner was not preceded by alcohol, the person gets up the next day, feels normal. The dinner that was preceded by maybe a couple cocktails, because it's the weekend and people go out with their friends and they had a couple, 3 cocktails before dinner, then they have their healthy dinner. The next day, instead of feeling great, you are starving to death. Why is that? What did that alcohol before dinner with the same dinner do metabolically that now the next day you're so hungry?
That is such a good question. And it is one I have never thought of. And I don't drink alcohol, so I've never noticed before. I don't know, Coco. I can only speculate. It might be that usually alcohol is sweetened, right? That's pretty common. And so it might be that the combination of the insulin spiking from the sugars or the honey or whatever is in the alcohol, combined with the alcohol, which can only get metabolized in the liver, it might result in a kind of a delayed insulin release, where the alcohol preceding the meal itself, maybe that has prolonged the insulin curve. It very likely would. I'm quite confident that it would prolong the insulin curve, and that might result in a more prolonged energy deficiency, where the available energy, like the glucose and the ketones and the free fatty acids, is probably lower in the hours following that alcohol then meal, rather than just the meal itself. But the meal itself, you had an insulin spike, and then it came back down to normal, and you resolve all of that maybe more quickly than you would when the meal was preceded by alcohol. But this is all just speculation. I'm not sure.
No, I'm not either. I'm just curious. Would that in that situation, because I've heard that before from people that will have a few that they're ketogenic or intermittent fasting, healthy people, and once in a while they will have a drink and then they'll have their dinner, and the next day they're much hungrier. What would you recommend that person to eat for breakfast? Because when there is that hunger, I assume that the first reaction is, let me grab a slice of bread, or if there is cereal around, let me have a bowl of cereal. What would be the balancing breakfast in that situation?
Yeah. In fact, my advice to them would be the same advice to everyone, which is be really strict with breakfast. I think there's a tremendous opportunity when it comes to breakfast, and that's based on what insulin has done. So overnight, a person has been fasting, whether it's deliberate or not. They're not eating while they sleep. And that's a nice break, because insulin can finally come down overnight. And it takes several hours to come down after whatever that meal might have been. And usually, and this is me speculating, involved in the meal, it probably is, in fact, even a later than normal meal. Maybe it's something that they're doing at 7 or 8 p.m. And so insulin will take up to 3 to 4 hours to come down to normal. And so insulin has come down, and the body is becoming more insulin sensitive when insulin is down, and the body is burning more fat, because something we haven't spoken about, where the body has two primary energy sources: blood sugar or glucose and fat. And insulin is what dictates what the body is using. When insulin is high, the body is sugar burning. When insulin is low, the body is fat burning. And so over the night, as insulin has come down, we have allowed our bodies to transition into a fat burning state. And now, tragically, when we eat breakfast, so often, as you noted, breakfast is bagels or toast or cereal and orange juice. It's just pure insulin spiking garbage. And so we've just gotten into fat burning for a few hours, insulin sensitizing for a few hours, and we immediately turn that off because we eat a starchy, sugary breakfast, and our glucose and our insulin levels spike, and we immediately go to sugar burning mode. And then, unfortunately, I believe we set ourselves up to fail for the remainder of the entire day, because we eat that sugary breakfast, insulin comes up and glucose comes up, and then the glucose drops really quickly. And during that drop, when it has gone a little low, available energy is down. And so the brain says, oh, wait, I'm hungry again. And so 2 or 3 hours later, they have their mid-morning snack, and then they have their starchy lunch, their sugary mid-afternoon snack, and then they do it for dinner and their evening snack. So every moment of the day is spent with elevated insulin, which is making the body more insulin resistant, and it's turning off fat burning because the body is in sugar burning. And good luck trying to shrink your fat cells when you're just in sugar burning mode all day. So my advice, whether that evening meal preceding that day was with alcohol or not, it doesn't change my advice, which is, if you need to eat breakfast, which is, are you hungry or not, make sure you focus on proteins and fats. Be very careful with the carbohydrates, because proteins and fats will have very modest effect on insulin, and almost none. And so focus on the protein and fat, and then push the carbohydrates away, or make sure that the carbohydrates are not going to be starchy or sugary.
In that "be real, not ideal," which is the slogan of my channel, we have to be realistic on what people, we're humans that socialize, and sometimes we may want to have dessert, or we may want to have something that we know is not the best for us. what would be the time of the day if we're going to have a meal? And because I was very interested on what you said. If you have a breakfast that is high in sugar or carbohydrates, next thing you know, you're going to want to eat because your brain tells you that you want to eat. Would that mean that maybe if I choose once in a while to have a sugary meal, be best to have it before bed since my brain will have to go to sleep? Or what's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Actually, I think lunch is for me, and I'll elaborate. I think lunchtime, midday or early afternoon is probably the best time to indulge. Now, socially, to your point, most of that indulgence will come in the evening because that's when we are socializing. But for me, so metabolically, I don't know that either of those times will be any better or worse than the other, afternoon or evening. However, practically speaking of being real, for me, when I indulge in a sweet or a treat in the evening, it is very hard for me to stop. That once I've started eating this, it is so difficult for me to, if I'm eating some ice cream, I have a few bites, I don't want to stop in the evening. I want to keep eating it. So for me, and I know others are like this, I am at my weakest. I'm most susceptible to temptation in the evening. However, at lunch, I'm much more disciplined. I can control my appetite and my temptations for unhealthy foods much, much better. And I also think we don't want to eat too much in the evening because then we sleep very, very poorly. If we have a full stomach, uncomfortably full, and we're busy digesting, you will every night sleep worse than you would otherwise. Your body temperature will be higher, and that's not conducive to a good sleep, and your intestines will be uncomfortable. So I think we should eat bigger lunches and more modest sized dinners. Not that we don't eat dinner, I'm not saying that, but I think dinner is a time where we ought to be a little more strict, because our temptations to indulge and the consequences it will have on sleep will carry over to the next day and make the next day even harder to do well with.
What would be the latest time to have dinner? How many hours before you go to bed?
Yeah, so I typically like to say about 3 to 4 hours before bed, if possible, just because by then the food is leaving your stomach, and you're going to be a little more comfortable when you go to sleep.
Would that be 3 or 4 hours from the time that you start or you finish? Because like if you start dinner and you're a slow eater like myself, I will still be eating 90 minutes later because I have kids and we're talking. So
Yeah,
if I
yeah.
count from 6, then I go to bed to 10. What's the sweet spot there?
Yeah, yeah. So I can only speculate, but I love that you say this because, the average American, we eat so quickly. And that is one of the things I envy about other cultures. As even with my family, we have traveled around the world and lived in multiple different countries. Other cultures have such a different view of eating. It is such a more social time to enjoy. So I think it's funny that you, being from Europe originally, you're bringing this up where European cultures let the meal be a big meal. It's a time to socialize. Whereas in the US, it's just give me my food, I eat, and I'm done because I need to go do something else. So I'm not sure. I would say ideally, I don't know, Coco. Maybe let's go right in the middle. Let's go right in the middle. It would not be fair to start at the beginning of the meal,
If you're
because
slower like me, I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
our,
because
our
then nothing.
meals in Europe will last. It's a time that if you've been in European cultures, I grew up in Spain. It's a time that you talk about the day, you fight, you make peace. I mean, it all happens while very, it's just very boisterous. In fact, it's just a small anecdote. The first time my husband visited my family in Spain, we were all in that small kitchen. Surface areas are smaller in Europe, and when we were there for 2 hours, and when we finished, he didn't speak the language, so he told me, he said, what was the argument about? And I looked at him and I said, what argument? I said, well, it's obvious you guys were like intensely discussing something. It's like, oh no, we're just talking about the day and
Yeah.
and how it went. But yeah, culturally for us, dinner or whatever is the meal, it used to be lunch when I was growing up. Now, due to work, a lot of people have to have lunch outside of the home, but there is usually a long dinner on the table, around the table with the family, and it's usually longer. It's not about eating; it's about just talking and having a conversation.
Yeah, well, I think that's beautiful. I really, really do. To me, family is the most important thing in the world. So your sentiments really resonate with me. I would just say, if it were possible, let lunch be the bigger social meal. But I agree, it just doesn't work that way. The kids are at school, the parents are busy. Dinner is the social meal, which is why I will always eat it with my family. And I try to recreate even what you're describing, where maybe it's not going to be so long. My kids are kind of young, but I want it to be a time when we are all together and we're talking. And so even my general dietary plan is to control carbohydrates, and I really focus on protein and fat. I'm a middle-aged guy. I'm in my mid-40s, and I want to stay lean and strong and healthy. But I don't have those same restrictions for my little growing children. I'm very much in favor of them eating more carbohydrates than I want to personally. And so dinner for me, like I'm very strict with my breakfast. I'm very strict with my lunch. Dinner is whatever the family is eating. And so if they want to make some pasta or they want pizza, if there's a way for me to easily control the carbohydrates in my own diet, then I will. But if it's going to change the way I'm interacting with my family, I will not do that. I will eat the dinner that my family is having, because it's much more important to me that I'm spending that time with my wife and children than it is me staying with, high in ketosis or something for the whole time.
There is where the be real not ideal concept really comes into play. And now there is enough data, as you know, that there is a connection through the vagus nerve and the microbiome and your parasympathetic system sending messages on your brain when you are calm. You're calm, you're enjoying your meal, and that releases digestive enzymes. So many times we are, and I am very strict, but as strict to a point, as you say, we have to understand that we are going to make conscious choices. And that's why these show that we are filming right now, as many others that many colleagues are doing around the world, are so important, because I feel that there is so much emphasis sometimes of being either this way or that way, but nothing in between. And my message to our viewers is, once in a while, you have to make the conscious choice of having ice cream, knowing that number one has sugar, most likely is made with hydrogenated fats or bad fats like soybean oil or one of the cheap oils. And you know all that, but you make the conscious choice that you're going to socially enjoy with your children, which we do occasionally. And that is the occasion. And that will be, in my opinion, more beneficial than harmful, just because of the whole social and psychological benefit, emotionally and also mentally. What's your take on that?
Oh, I echo these sentiments completely. I don't think we should look at a food as forbidden. I do think, as long as a person has a very clear structure, a plan in place, then that indulgence is absolutely okay. Of course, the devil is in the details, and it really comes when a person allows those indulgences to become the norm again,
Exactly.
after having been so strict. And so I think there's just some prudent um, steps a person can take, including maybe telling a spouse or a close friend, please don't let me eat more than one dish of ice cream. If you see me go again, I'm my own person. I'm going to do what I want, but please just say, hey, you wanted me to tell you not to eat a second. I'm just reminding you, whatever it may be. And I also think there's a benefit to trying to not have that indulgence happening in your home, or at least not too much. Because if this is a big ice cream party, for example, and then all that ice cream is left in your house after, that's going to be calling out to you all evening and the next evening. And so you either have a plan to get it out of the house immediately, you throw it away, or you let your guests take it with them, or you do it outside the house where it has never made its way in the home. And part of this is my own experience, as I have analyzed and struggled with my own food temptations, where people, we have this clever expression, moderation in all things, but say that to someone who's addicted, and now moderation doesn't mean anything, because if we tell the alcoholic, well, we're just going to have one glass of wine and then we'll be done. The alcohol can't do that. I think to a lesser degree, the ice creamaholic or the sugaraholic, you can just have some of it. maybe they can't just have some. Maybe for them, it's going to start this big binging cycle that's going to last for a few days before they can really kind of control themselves again. So, so I don't mean to make an argument for or against this strategy. In general, I think it is good. We ought to have room for indulgences, but we also need to be very honest with ourselves and have a plan to get over this. So my wife, for example, we will sometimes buy pints of ice cream, a little pint of ice cream, and we each will have our own pint. And my wife can open this pint and eat 4 or 5 bites, put the lid back on, and put the ice cream away. She is what I call a moderator. She can eat a little bit and truly moderate her own appetite. I don't have that ability. I am an abstainer. It's better for me never even to start than it is to stop. Because if I open up that lid of ice cream and start eating it, I will eat the whole thing all the way down. Even when I'm full and I feel done, I just have a very hard time stopping. And so it's easier for me to never even start. And this is reflective of a very wonderful expression of, I think, an old Catholic saint who said, abstinence is easier than perfect moderation. And for me, that's true. It is easier for me never to indulge in the treat than it is to stop indulging. And so when we have treats in the house, and we sometimes will, I try to very much make sure we only have enough of that treat for that one single event. Like, let's say, ice cream. If children are coming over and my kids are having a party, whatever is left, we will throw away.
That's brilliant. And I echo the same exact strategy. In fact, I encourage my children, because at home we're extremely strict. We have snacks all the time. And I tell them, we have fast food. It's called fruit. You want fast food? Pick any piece of fruit, anything. And we have all sorts of fruits. I mean, anything you can imagine. We have a refrigerator full with everything. And that's fast food. But when we go out, which we don't do very often, but when we do, here's the rule. If you want to have a soda, you have to drink a 16-ounce glass of water without any ice. After you drink that, you can order whatever soda you want. I'll buy it for you. And, my 17-year-old, that I started that strategy when he was like 5, we went out a little more when he was little because we had 1, now we have 4, so it's a little bit different. But that was a strategy, because he'd be like, well, why can't I have a soda and other kids are having it? And I said, I don't want him to have a bad relationship with food. So I said, okay, This is the deal. You have a big tall glass of water, and whatever drink, even if you want a kitty cocktail, I'll buy you that. That's the worst thing. But what I found is that after he drank that glass of water, he never wanted the soda. Or I would order the soda and he would have just a little sip because he was satisfied. He wasn't thirsty. So when we go out, I do encourage my kids, order whatever you want. But first, you have to drink your water and perhaps have a small meal of something that is healthy. And what I've noticed is that then they don't devour, whatever it is that they have chosen, because I grew up in a very healthy lifestyle family where, everything was demonized, from sugar to fast food to everything. And that I felt that it created more of an anxiety of wanting to eat the bad food, and ended up like hiding away and eating sugary, taking my friend's breakfast. You're not going to eat that muffin, I'll have it. And being chunky when I was a teenager because of that relationship. And I found that just converting it into like, no, you can have it. Let's do it this way. It's worked for us. So if it works for our listeners, and I love your concept of do it outside of the home, if that is something that is going to create or procrastinate the stop. If you're going to be chronically finishing that ice cream run, I've listened to so many of your interviews, your relationship with cereal, that you love cereal.
No. Don't even mention cereal. Don't even mention cereal, Coco. It triggers me. I'm so addicted to cereal. And I wasn't raised eating cereal, and that's something that a habit I got into in college. Of course, every college student eats their body weight in cereal every week. And that is a temptation I have struggled with to this day. I've been out of college for 20 years, and I still, every evening, if there's cereal in the home, I will eat myself sick. And so we just don't have it.
And that's a great thing. We don't have cereal in the house. I just feel the exact same way. And I think that for parents, sometimes it's hard. And we were discussing this with Dr. Lasik before, because we feel that our kids are happy when they eat something that they like. And he pointed out something that he had written in his previous book, the Hacking of the American Mind. It's not happiness, it's pleasure. They feel pleasure, but that doesn't equate to happiness. So teaching them that we can have pleasure in specific points, that's okay. But chronically providing them that pleasure as their source of food, because we think that makes them happy, we create a generation of sick children. So going back to the sick children, let me ask you one last question, because I want to be respectful of your time. Diseases like diabetes, in your chapter 10, I think you talk about hormones and you talk about the beta cells. Can somebody with type 2 diabetes reverse it? Is it curable? Because according to the American Diabetes Association, is an incurable disease. What have you seen?
Yeah. I think it is absolutely reversible, and dare I say curable. It just depends on how we look at the disease. If someone looks at someone with type 2 diabetes, if we view type 2 diabetes as a disease that can only be treated with drugs, then it is incurable. They will never stop taking drugs. They will only take more of the dose of the same drug and include and add more drugs to that as the body naturally becomes resistant to whatever the drug is that they started with or continue to take. So if you treat diabetes with drugs, type 2 diabetes, then you will never get better. You will always have the problem. However, if you acknowledge that type 2 diabetes is a disease of diet, now you use diet to treat the problem, it can go away 100%. We had a study from 2 years ago. We took middle-aged women with full type 2 diabetes, and in the clinic, this was a collaboration with a clinic, because as you noted, I'm a scientist, I'm in my lab. But in working with a local clinic, the clinician, the physician told the patient, you can leave my office. So he said, one, you have type 2 diabetes. Now what to do about it? You can leave my office with a prescription for a drug. The consequence will be you take it forever, probably the rest of your life, or you leave with a prescription to change your diet, control carbohydrates, prioritize protein, don't fear fat. That's basically the simple rules of it. And then what they did, these 11 women elected to take the dietary route. And within 90 days, there was no clinical evidence of the type 2 diabetes. We had cured the type 2 diabetes. And that's because we looked at it the right way. Type 2 diabetes is a disease of diet. And the food we eat is either the culprit or the cure. It's causing the problem or it's curing the problem.
Do you foresee in the near future a change with the wave of evidence, with the wave of authors, scientists, researchers, clinicians, you name it, that we all are pointing to the same cause, the same culprit? Do you see a change coming? Can we be optimistic?
Yeah, I see a small change coming, but not a big one, because there's too much money to be made from selling drugs. And so that's why I don't think a low carb diet will ever be mainstream. I don't think it will ever be the first line like it should. But I think the sheer amount of evidence, the overwhelming mountain of evidence, cannot be ignored. That is why even these slow moving entities like the American Diabetes Association now have included, they have words, they have lines, statements about how effective low carbohydrate diets can be. You cannot deny the evidence, but I don't think it will ever be mainstream because there's so much money to be made from diabetes drugs. And if you change your diet, then you don't really need the diabetes drugs, and that's bad business.
Do you see that in any other diseases in addition to diabetes? Do you think that that is going to be the case for everything else?
Yes, to varying degrees, I do. For example, migraine headaches. People who go onto a low carbohydrate ketogenic diet will very often never have another migraine headache again, as long as they are adhering to that diet. And one of my colleagues, just in my hallway here on campus, he has had this exact thing happen. He had migraines for years, about one a week. He went on a low carbohydrate diet, and he went from having one migraine a week to having about one every 6 months. It's totally changed his life. But changing your diet is hard. People don't want to do hard things. And so if you are told from your doctor, well, you can go on this kind of strict low carbohydrate diet, or I can give you a medication. The low carb diet will work better, but it's harder, or I can give you a medication. It won't work as well, and there'll be side effects that you don't want, but it's just really easy because you take one pill per day. Many people, unfortunately, will take the easy route, even though it's less effective. And so I think the combination of these competing interests and the desires of the patient, or we ourselves, will make diet never be the mainstream advice, because the physician, or there's some perverse incentive, not to speak evil of physicians, I don't mean to, but there's a lot of money to be made from giving a drug prescription. So there'll always be that competing interest, and it's human nature to not want to do something that's hard. And so people will, rather than a dietary plan.
In physician's defense, do you feel that a lot of practitioners, I found over the years, let's put it this way, that most of the practitioners that have taken the dietary approach, or that they have looked beyond the drugs, have been those practitioners that themselves have been sick. Something has happened to them, that it was the catalyzer that said, okay, these drugs are not working, I have to look into something else. Do you feel that there is an overwhelming kind of like gray cloud, if you want to say, on these all of these practitioners that don't want to look outside? Why is that so many of them? They're in this bubble, and even the thought, I mean, I have my own thoughts and I'll share them with you after, but they're in this bubble that has a little door, and they seek out, is like, oh, I don't want to look there. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, I think there's probably two reasons. One, they don't have the knowledge that this diet can work, that there really can be something beneficial about it. Maybe because they haven't experienced it themselves, or they're not familiar with the published literature. And then two, it also might be a matter of what they've been told is good or bad, and maybe there's a fear. I know some physicians who will be talking. They will tell me personally, I have a patient who has diabetes and hypertension, and I would love to put them on a low carbohydrate diet. I'm afraid of what might happen. So many doctors are afraid that if they do this, what if something bad happened? Then because that goes against conventional advice to put someone on a low carbohydrate diet, then they fear that they could be sued, that there would be some litigation, some very negative consequence. So I suspect many doctors probably fall into that latter category, and I get it. That's a scary thing to think about, being legally liable because you gave advice that, say, went against the advice given by the American Heart Association, which I think has terrible advice. But even still, if you challenge the norm, there is a potential negative consequence. The good consequence could be that you help your patients get better and healthier than ever. And I know many physicians who have done that. But even still, even these physicians who prescribe a low-carb diet to help their patients get better and resolve their diabetes or their infertility or their hypertension, they're a little afraid that, well, what happens of the thousands of patients who've done this, one maybe has a heart attack and it's not related to the diet at all. Am I going to lose my license? I get it. So I think it's a combination. In many instances, they're ignorant. They don't know of the benefits. And then in others, they know the benefits. They're just a little afraid of the legal liability.
Yeah, I agree with you. The status quo, which happened, many centuries ago, when the seamen were coming across America and they were dying because of lack of vitamin C, had been established, and it took 200 years for them to say, "Oh yes, of vitamin C deficiency. Let's put some limes in the book. Now the ships will have limes and they won't die." But the status quo was too hard. And in that line, my take on that is, and I agree totally with you with the fear factor, because of the fear factor, we sometimes make decisions that we wouldn't make just because we have fear. But in addition to that, it's also maybe the realization that if I have spent over a decade of my life in medical school and residency and all of these years of education, and now I have to relearn it because I've been told a lie, what else is not true? I mean, it's kind of like the tip of the iceberg. If I've been told that the only treatment for diabetes is metformin and insulin, and that you can have sugar, in fact, you should have sugar because it stimulates the pancreas and it's kind of good for you. what else have I been told that is not true? And I feel even with couples, I have friends that both of them are practitioners, MDs, and one of them is very proactive on prevention, and the other one doesn't even want to look at it. And I think it's the fear of knowing that you've been lied or maybe not told the whole truth. Do you think that there is any truth to that?
Yeah, I think that's human nature, and all the more relevant to people who have big degrees after their name. It's hard for us to acknowledge when we don't know something. It takes tremendous humility to say, "Oh, one, I don't know everything, and two, even some of what I do know might be wrong." That it's hard to do when someone has a PhD or an MD, these big degrees after their names. And it's human nature, of course. We don't like to admit when we don't know something, and we certainly don't like to admit that we're wrong. You have to be humble. And that is where I think, to a degree, if I may be, this may sound smug, I know, but I don't mean for it to, we should all think like scientists. Now, I know nowadays in the era of this, I don't even want to say it lest we get in trouble, but this viral infection that's scaring the whole world. Nowadays, scientists are almost looked at as gods. They're these perfect beings that know everything. And I think that is a terribly unscientific view. We should all be scientists in the purest sense, which is that we are all seeking truth. In the purest sense, a scientist is trying to understand one single thing and prove whether this one thing is true or false. Is it real or is it not real? And we should apply that to certainly to medical advice and nutrition, but we have to be very humble in that process. I have had to be humble in the 10 years or so that I've been learning of the relevance of insulin. It very much challenged my views on diet and nutrition. I was as much an opponent to saturated fat and fats in general as anyone was 10 years ago. I very much thought it was just calories in, calories out, and saturated fat is the worst of all of them. And it was painful for me to intellectually uncomfortable for me to realize, wait, that was wrong. Everything I learned was wrong. So to a degree, now I'm not humble in other ways, of course. I'm very proud and egotistical in other ways. But with nutritional research, I'm so grateful that I was humble and that I was able to just step back. The data side helped me decide what was real or not. But that's what too many people don't realize, physicians included, just the strength of evidence that is out there, the sheer, as I said, mountain of scientific publications that defend the use of low carbohydrate diets. And that's why I always tell my physician friends, I said, look, if you had to go to court, call me as your defensive witness, because I can cite dozens and dozens of scientific manuscripts, and that is the evidence that defends the view that low carbohydrate diets can be very healthy and should always be considered in the scope of heart and metabolic health.
Dr. Benjamin Bikman, what a pleasure. How inspiring to speak with you. I'm a great fan of your work. I listen, I read everything that you publish, and I learn always, because I always think that we all know what we know, but we ignore what we don't know. And in that window is where we live. In that window of what we don't know, we live. And you really opened up a window of knowledge for many of us on the aspects and the role of insulin on our health. So thank you. Thank you so much for being with us, Ben.
Oh, this has been an absolute pleasure, Coco. Thanks so much. And I hope the audience has really learned something.
Thank you.